Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. So we are coming almost to end of our FCPM program. One more sessions to go. We were talking mainly about symptom control and communication. Now we are going to talk about the end of life. We know we have managed end of life for many patients, but um, many times we might feel that did we do the right thing for that patient, or was there anything else that I should have done? So these are some doubts in our mind. uh, we know for every patient we have to this is how I have practiced while I do my internship. When patient starts gasping, there will be injection terifluin Dexona, then oxygen mask, probably for the namesake chest compression. This is what it is being practiced. We will hear whether that was right and what can be done in such situation. So today, Rajagopal sir will be talking about end of life care. So for those who don't know, sir, sir is the director of Trivandrum Institute of Palliative Sciences and chairman of Pallium India. So welcome, sir, and it's over to you. Sir, you are muted.
Thank you, Sunil, and thank you, Arun, and good afternoon, everybody. I can see only one participant in front of me, Dr. Kanagasabha, and I got a smile from Dr. Kanagasabha. Everybody else has a video off. I can totally understand it if your connectivity is low. If not, please switch your video on. Let us talk face to face. Being online is bad enough, but talking to a blank screen is more painful. Uh, Arun and Raju, if you are listening, I think we should make this an information available to everybody. The idea of one of the things in ECHO is that an interaction, face-to-face interaction is possible. And that is not possible if you have the video off. I know that in some parts of the country, connectivity may be poor, then I'll completely understand it. But the fact that you didn't get time to comb your hair is not enough reason. Divya, that's okay. You look absolutely beautiful, absolutely no problem. Thank you for having your video on, and I think we should make it a general practice. Sunil talked about how we were trained and how we managed as interns. I think he was much more confident as an intern than I. Half a century back, my medical training included a lot about diseases. I think I had more information on mitral stenosis than anything else. Exciting murmurs, and then consolidation. A little bit about palpating the liver and the spleen. We were concerned only with those cases which will come up for the exam. So much so, when I became an intern and got a call on the first night from a sister saying that patient is dying, come quick. I was scared stiff. I knew absolutely nothing about what is to be done. As Sunil said, we had a sort of idea that it was necessary to give an intravenous respiratory stimulant and a dose of corticosteroids. Good heavens, what for? So this respiratory stimulant and the corticosteroid were two things that they could take with them to heaven. But that would have been okay. And then we had to jump on the chest for everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, all of us will die someday. Some of you will be able to think about it. Some of you will not be able to think about it. Some of you are scared. That's normal. There are 16 people. I suppose the 16 includes Sunil, me, and Arun. So at least 13 people in the audience. That's a very small number. Sunil, is this a small batch? Or are many people absent?
No, many people are absent.
So that is something that maybe we can talk about later. Of the 13 participants here, let me ask you, who are all able to think about your own death? The thought of your own death, is it acceptable to you? Are you able to think about it? Dr. Kanagasabha straight away raises his hand, ready hand. The others, if you know how to, yes, Gopal Nair, thank you. Namrata, anybody else? Look, out of the 13 or 14 people, 3 people have straight away said by chat and by electronic raising of the hand that they are able to think about it. Now, this is serious. Ladies and gentlemen, to be able to help people who are dying, we need to be able to accept our own mortality. If you are not able to accept that you are mortal, you will jump on chests unnecessarily and make a mockery of the dying process, insult dead bodies. So, to the 10 people who are not able to think about it, my recommendation is maybe you should read about it. Maybe somebody is either trying to talk to me or ordering something for lunch. I don't understand which. If you are not trying to talk to me, please keep the microphone muted. Uh, so I am asking you, the 10 people, to maybe at some point of time think about it. In Bhutan, there is a custom. Every human being has to think about one's own death 5 times a day. I keep repeating this because remember that Bhutanese are also among the happiest people on earth by Global Happiness Index. Being able to accept our mortality helps us to appreciate life better. And in this context, it will also help us to help people who are dying. So, as a house surgeon, when I got that call, I was praying. I don't know what to do. So I prayed that I hope he is dead by the time I come so that I don't have to do anything. My prayers were answered. The person was already dead. The nurse was there. She knew what to do, which was precious little. Uh, I told the family it's all over. I did not even know how to diagnose death. I depended on the nurse. And I quickly walked to the nurse's cubicle and started filling out a form. I knew how to fill that certificate. Aha. And when I talk to young medical graduates, I find that they are in the same boat. If anything, they have worse ideas about what is to be done. And as palliative care physicians, we need to think more about it and be prepared to act on it. With your permission, I'll share this screen. I'm going to read out one. I mean, no, I'm going to show you the a passage from one uh, person by name Sindhu. Who wrote in the Hindu an article about her father's death. Would somebody? Why should I waste? I mean, spend my own vocal cords, exercise my own vocal cords. Who is going to help me to read it out? Please unmute your microphone and read out. Somebody.
I will do it, sir.
Yes, please.
Uh,
Sorry about that.
Sir, it is my 84-year-old father, my best friend, was enduring raw, intrusive medical procedures against his own wish. All skin and bones, he looked defenseless and at the mercy of doctors, his arms tied up, vulnerable and agonized.
If you are agitated, delirious, agitated, the worst thing that can be done to you is to tie your hands and feet up. We do that so that they don't pull out the tubes which are we put in on unnecessarily on dying people. This is assault and battery on a person. I would call it a criminal offense if you try to do it to me. The world, the medical world, accepts chemical restraint, that is, if necessary, giving enough sedatives to prevent agitation, but not this tying people up. I'm giving you two images. This is the way a poor person dies. A few drops of water with a gentle touch on the forehead from a loving hand in a steel tumbler. That happens to the poor person. Whereas I will not talk to the third 10 people who did not raise their hands, but I'm speaking specifically to the three people. Whoever has not muted the microphone, please mute it. To the three people, let me tell you, this is the way, I'm sorry, this is the way you are likely to die unless you are able to protect yourself against the hospitals and doctors. The arms tied up, tubes in every orifice, and whether it's advanced cancer or dementia. I don't, can you not mute participants from here?
Yes,
You
sir.
should be able to do that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I will do.
So this is the injustice that actually happens. So I wanted to tell you more about this injustice. This is horrible. This violates all principles of medical ethics. It happens more in India than in the Western countries. The four fundamental principles of medical ethics are autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. Everything is violated here. This is against the person's autonomy. This is not good for the person. It causes harm, and it's unfair wastage of resources to cause harm. Officially, India does not have a law which lays out what a doctor's duty of care is. This comes from a statutory body of the Indian government, Indian Council of Medical Research, which says the healthcare provider's duty of care is to mitigate suffering. It is to cure sometimes, relieve often, and to comfort always. And ICMR adds this sentence: there exists no exception to this rule. Would any other participants want to ask a question? You find it easy to accept this, or do you have a problem with this statement?
All of you agrees with this statement, or do you have any more comments?
I'll be a bit more specific with my question.
Yeah,
Do you,
Dr. Paul today. Parul,
sorry,
Parul.
Parul?
Sir, when we actually started reading more of palliative care, this is when we realized that we need to put full stop to the interventions that we do and follow the thing that, the comfort is what we should target always, and not try to, try invasive interventions and try to cure and treat death as a failure of treatment, but to step one step back and let the things take their own natural course. So being trained in critical care, I was in a different thing, like all the invasive things, whatever you can do, you do. But then when we got into the concept of palliative care, this is when probably the more fineness of care, that okay, even though you know what has to be done now, you still need to step back and provide comfort to the patient rather than trying to prolong death. So this is what I want to say about this.
Very good, Parul. Thank you very much. Parul, where do you work? Which
Sir,
city? Which city?
sir, I work in Dubai. I work in a trauma
Okay.
center, sir. Yeah.
Parul,
Yeah.
towards the end of your few words, you said, even though you know what is to be done, we still learn to step back.
Yeah.
Do you mean to say that continuing aggressive interventions is what you think you should do? Are
Sir,
you a bit confused?
Sir, the thing is, like I am in Middle East, where actually the things that we used to practice in India, allow natural death, do not resuscitate, and knowing how is the outcome, and then trying to be less invasive and be more, trying to comfort the patient, taking care of the things. So here it is always probably one thing which I noticed the difference in Middle East, that finances per se is not a problem. People are well off, and maybe religious sentiments or the guilt feeling. Sir, I have myself under our care ventilated a patient with hypoxic brain damage for 4 years, because there are no clear cut end of life rules, and the relatives want that to keep the patient alive as long as possible. They don't want to take the guilt, and they are not paying from their pocket. It is the government which takes care, which probably goes against the things in which I was trained, that when there is no functional life, why are we prolonging death on ventilator? But our hands are tied in the hands of, the rules are such, because the guidelines are not clear. So this
Parul,
is
thank
one.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Parul. I totally agree. But let me tell you, Parul, it's not only in Dubai.
Yeah.
It happens all the time in India. Anybody who gets into 99% of hospitals, if you have enough money, you are subjected to aggressive interventions till the last day of your life. It doesn't happen in USA, doesn't happen in the UK and Western countries. 75% of patients get withdrawn from ventilator or given palliative care instead. Here, where we cannot afford it, we in India continue to do this. Thank you, Parul, for the comment. Please, Parul, would you
Sure, sir.
would you agree with this? That's prime. If I am your patient, Parul, your primary objective should be to keep me as comfortable as possible physically and emotionally, not to isolate me and subject me to aggressive interventions, which will take away my comfort and take away everything that's important to me, like the love from my family. So, what everybody is, I don't, please mute everybody. So, what we should do to give the person comfort, recognize that end of life is an important time. This is a time for me to think. You keep me comfortable. I may want to re-establish relationships. I may want to see Sunil once more and say some important things to him and to listen to him. I may want to apologize to him for losing my temper or being unfair to him. I may want to talk to Arun and tell him a few things like how good he is. I may want to tell Sunil how good he is. I may want to tell my family, I apologize to you for whatever I have not done. Thank you for giving me love. These are important things. If I am to do that, you have to give me comfort and you have to keep me with my family. Do you have to worry? Do I know I am dying? If I want to know, I have to know. Do I know the diagnosis? Do I know the prognosis? Do I know that I may be dying? Have I expressed views about where I am to be cared for? The three people who expressed willingness to think about your own death, where would you like to die? Hospital room, intensive care unit, your own home.
Please unmute and speak. Yeah, Dr. Namrata says at home.
Namrata, at home, Namrata, provided.
At home, sir.
At home. I will qualify. We would all like to die at home, provided you get enough medical support at home. Because you may be in pain, you may be breathless, you should get help. And home is where one feels connected. Very good.
Yeah, Dr. Gopal says, home with my loved ones around me.
Absolutely. But I qualify, Sunil, if we are to make that possible, we will have to assure them of reasonable comfort in their home because they may have an illness which may make them uncomfortable. So we want to know this. How will you know? How will you know unless you are able to initiate a conversation? And if you are afraid of your own death, how will you have the courage to talk about death to a patient? I will have to sit down with the patient. Sister, do you know what the disease is? Do you want to know? I may have to talk to the family first and get their consent for this. This is what we actually do. I'm not preaching anything that we do not practice. Do you know about the curability of your illness? What do you think is happening to you? And they may ask, how long do I have, doctor? And I may say, I really do not know. Let's hope that it's a long time ahead. But sometimes it's easy to be prepared. It's better to be prepared. Do you have any unfinished business? Is there anything that you need to do? Because if you finish that unfinished business, then you will be able to spend the remaining days in peace with your family. And I may, if the person is willing to talk about that, on the first day they may not be. On the third day they will want to. Then I will say, you asked about death. You talked about death. When it happens, where do you want to be? Etc. Those wishes need to be respected as much as possible. And home, hospital or intensive care, artificial life support, etc. need to be discussed. Rarely somebody may say, it actually happened to me. One person told me, do anything that you have to do. Do use any machine, but keep me alive till the 25th. I want my son to see me alive. I respected that. We gave her critical care. And one of the things, ladies and gentlemen, that we must be clear is what is our objective. When we know somebody is clearly dying, what's the point of doing serum sodium? Fall in sodium, hyponatremia, is part of the dying process. The situation is different if somebody has a pneumonia and hyponatremia. Pneumonia is reversible, so hyponatremia must be treated actively. But if it is somebody dying, oh my God, it's such a cruelty to give them hypertonic saline. And then you take them into the ICU for to do that, take him away from the family. And that hypertonic saline actually causes more congestion in the heart, in the lungs, and makes breathing worse. Stop all. Such a pity that people have made to force to swallow so much atorvastatin 3 days before they die. What a cruel joke. Stop routine blood checks. Stop intravenous things as much as possible. If you need hydration, you can get subcutaneous hydration. You can give medicines rectally. As far as possible, avoid intravenous lines in the last few days because they have phlebitis very easily. And that itself becomes a source of pain, discomfort, and limitation of movement. Another report, newspaper article from the Business Standard written by Parthasarathi Show, who was financial advisor to the previous Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, about his mother. Who is going to read it out for me? Volunteer, please, to read this out. Please unmute and read.
I'll read it.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Even on the day of fasting, specialist recommended a liver function procedure. When asked if it would end the coma, the answer was in negative. This is the statement by
Continue.
Female nurses hurried about, pushing and shoving the inert body, robbing any peace, contemplation, or prayer. Where was the palliative care?
So, you must know that a lot of thinking people, accept it as the norm. Okay, ICU. Okay, bill of 16 lakhs. Okay, they go home. But a lot of people think about this injustice. There is a lot of anger in the community against us, against the medical profession for what we do, which is of questionable ethical principles behind it. So, at some point, we'll start asking, how is he or how is she? Rather than what's the BP. On the last day, if I have a good agreement with the family, I would stop checking the BP. Why? What's the point? Position change and skin care will be a balance between prevention of pressure sores. Even on the last 3 days, we do not want a pressure sore. But every 2 hours may be too much. If the person seems to be sleeping peacefully, I will postpone it by 2 more hours. I would rather give an airbed so that pressure sores are avoided. And one of the things that ladies and gentlemen, one of the things that I would like you to ask you to remember is that even the person who is apparently unconscious may be able to hear and understand. A friend of mine who had a stroke and was immobile and aphasic for 3 months said the worst part of the 3 months is nobody talked to him about what was happening. 3 months of anxiety, not knowing what was happening. What do we lose? Even if they are apparently unconscious, talk to them as if that's a person. I am going to turn you. Uncle, how are you today? What do we lose? We are going to change your sheets. Say that. And Parul, you mentioned intensive care unit in Dubai. One of the things that happens in intensive care units is you give so much of attention to the patient's chemistry and vitals that you forget that the family may be angry, may be sad, may be in depression, may not be eating, may have stopped their anti-diabetic medication, and may be in a serious condition. In palliative care, what we accept that palliative care is for the patient and family is something that the whole healthcare should accept. And when we talk about the family, particularly remember children, they need explanations. And please remember this when diseases happen in your own families, extended families. Nobody gives explanations with children. Children grow up with terrible fears. They need information. Always facilitate religious rites, even in an ICU. A last communion may be very important. The prayers would be important. The chanting of the Ramayana may be very important. Encourage the family's presence wherever possible. And that's totally against what we do now. We push the family out when the person is dying. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to come back from heaven and haunt you if you do that to me. I want my family with me, if at all possible. When I am scared, I want my son's hand to hang on to. And we will, if at all possible, we will spend time with the family, looking after their health and emotional needs. When you come out of the ICU, you see the anxious face of the wife and children, or the husband, or the parent. Ask them, how are you? This must be a very difficult time for you. And in palliative care, Sunil and his colleagues always ask the family members, do you have any medical issues? Are you going, have you stopped any medication? And sometimes you check a patient's family members' sugar and find that they have stopped medication 1 week back and blood sugar is 430. You almost have a calamity on your hands. So as I said, this is not only about them. Remember, this is about us and our loved ones. Young doctors and young doctors listening to this, please remember, if you are able to think about this, you will be doing an enormous service to your own parents and grandparents. This is about us, not about someone else. Because if you provide inappropriate artificial life support measures, you are causing physical suffering, psychological suffering, and social suffering, financial destruction. What they should have is palliative care as part of healthcare. And if you withdraw a life support, let us have this very, very, very clear. If you withdraw life support, it is not anything to do with euthanasia. Many people have these doubts that withdrawal of life support is euthanasia. This is again from ICMR. Euthanasia is the intentional act of killing a terminal ill patient on voluntary request, okay. For the purpose of the good of the patient, okay. But it is the act of killing. And there is nothing that can be called passive euthanasia. Withdrawing life support is not passive euthanasia. Euthanasia involves an act of killing and it cannot be passive. If somebody is already on a ventilator, the question we'll have to be sure of our own facts. Is there an written advance directive? Is there a living will? 3 physicians perform the evaluation, listen to the family, answer their questions. We need to be on the same side, not on the opposite side. If we start arguing with them, we will never get anywhere. If you sit down with them, say something with empathy. This is a very difficult time for you. This must be very difficult. I would like to help you. And you want to do the best thing for him. I want to do the best thing for him. Let us try together. Give only realistic treatment options. If they are unable to take decisions, continue existing measures. Do not escalate life support. Continue existing measures and allow them time. If they say, okay, I would like to continue non-invasive ventilation for my dad, maybe you will agree with this. Sorry. And don't say, well, there are expensive things to do, but they are expensive and you may not be able to afford it. What's the point? You're only giving guilt to the family. And dear doctors, look at the last bullet point. This is something each one of us should take to heart. Never say there is nothing more to be done. Explain that care will continue to be available. There is no situation where nothing can be done. There is always something to be done. Maybe wiping a tear, it may be holding a hand. It may be to giving a dose of morphine to ease breathing. It may be giving some glycopyrrolate to prevent the rattling in the throat. It's very painful for the family to hear that there is nothing more to be done. And that is not true. Parul mentioned Dubai and a high-tech environment. Many of you, Divya also works in a high-tech hospital. I don't know many others. Most people are not visible. Many of you would have all facilities in your hospitals. When you are the director of the hospital, please create this. Always have a counseling room outside your critical care unit. In one hospital where Sunil and I worked together many years back, we created a palliative care unit outside step-down ICU. So from the high-tech critical care unit, the patient will come to a secondary area. The step-down ICU has high dependency unit. And from there, they are transferred to the palliative care unit, which is next door. The family doesn't feel that treatment has been stopped. And we share the counseling. This room is important. We underestimate the value of communication and we seldom give time. And to everybody here, young and old, please prepare your advanced medical directives. By a Supreme Court judgment, advanced medical directives are valid and binding on my physician. Sunil, I have written it. Okay, I'll show it to you one of these days. I have made it very clear that I do not want aggressive life support measures if I am dying of an incurable disease from which there is no reasonable chance, not 100%, reasonable chance to coming back to a life of reasonable quality. You have an ethical and legal duty to respect my wishes. And if I happen to be already on a ventilator, this happens. All of a sudden, there is a heart attack or something, you are rushed to the operation, somebody rushes me to the casualty. And before anybody knows what's happening, I'm already on a ventilator. And if artificial life support has already been started, giving it up means interaction with the family. It means you remembering your primary of duty of care as mitigating suffering, curing when possible, relieving always, and comforting always. If there is a conflict of opinion within the family or between you and the family, then legal issues are valid. If not, the legal issues need not come at all. You just take the decision. And that's what is being done to lakhs of people with COVID now. Doctors take the decision. No discussions, nothing is happening. So this is something that I would like you to remember. And it is 3:41. I'll stop there and take any questions. Sunil, thank you.
Thank you, sir. So anybody can ask anything about this topic? It's open for discussion. Dr. Padul?
Hello, good afternoon all.
Hi.
Sir, it was such a good discussion. And in fact, as I have mentioned, it is such an area. So what are the measures that I can take from my level, irrespective of the rules or what are the legal hazards or what the policies a hospital has? And how can we actually implement it on our day-to-day care that we are giving to our patients? Because I feel it is not just a one man who can do everything. The mindset, it has to change the mindset of everybody who is involved in the care, right from the nurses to me, the primary physician, the intensivist, and and then the scope for discussion for the family that they should also be ready to forego the treatment and understand. So, sir, I feel how to go about it. How can we do more about it
Uh,
practically?
Varun, thank you
Yeah.
for asking the question. You are not an island. You cannot change the world all by yourself. But many people must be having your question in their own minds. So, would anybody have a suggestion about this?
Yes,
Sir,
sir. Increase the awareness among people and make a clear-cut law on DNR like they have abroad. And unless and until we do that, sir, it will continue to remain a gray area.
Uh, there are two things that. Who said that? Sorry, Dr. Govardhan.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, sir.
Dr. Gopal, yes, good ideas. I completely agree. But changing a law in our country or in any country, but particularly in our country, is very difficult. We took 19 years. Our effort started in uh, 1995. Took 19 years for changing the narcotics rules, the NDPS Act. 19 years. So creating a law is difficult. Actually, Government of India published some model rules. This happened in 2016. They put it upon the website for changing the law, asked for public opinions. I understand that more than 1,300 opinions went to the government. Many of us had submitted changed terminology and but nothing happened. You should also know that at every session of the parliament, usually more than 200 items of legislation are tabled, and only less than 10% actually get considered. Everything else is postponed. So that may not be an easy solution. That's very necessary. Law is necessary, I agree. In the meantime, anybody has any suggestion of what we can do in the current environment? Parul was asking, what can I do now?
Counseling, sir, as you told, speaking with the family and all together, the critical care specialist, palliative care, and the patients attenders, and all together. If patient is unable to speak, if not the attenders, and
Divya, did I hear you say that?
yes, sir.
Divya, so if you alone in your hospital start talking about these things, already you are considered a crazy girl by everybody there. And if you start talking about it, only you talking about it, will the rest of the medical profession rise against you?
No, no, yes, sir. Actually, among doctors, it is very much needed. Among doctors, right from budding doctors, it has to start awareness to the doctors, budding doctors, MBBS students, and all the doctors, all specialists. The awareness has to be done. I think basically first among doctors and among general public, or both. It has to be done from all sides, from
Oh my
general
God.
public.
Look at
Every,
this girl. She is making it so complicated. We have to change, convert everybody, if Divya says. Sunil, with your permission, I am sharing another slide, just one slide for you to see. Dr. Gopal Nair, I have represented here
Yeah.
4 different pillars, the barriers. This is a personal opinion. This is not drawn to scale. I believe the biggest barrier is a doctor's perception of duty of care. What's your duty? Parul in her hospital has accepted that her duty is not to prolong the dying process, but to mitigate suffering. But the vast majority of doctors and administrators may not feel the same way. They may say that this girl is trying to kill people. So, one, and the family over the last quarter of a century, many people now think we don't want to lose the person. See, there are 2 kinds of love. The first that I have written here, I can't let my mother go. I can't live without my mom. That's a selfish kind of love. It's about me, not about her. That person is not able to think about my mother is suffering. I don't want her to suffer. That's a more valuable the kind of love. So family's love itself becomes a barrier. And then Divya wanted to change the whole society. The social factors are important. Divya has a point. If as soon as you talk about it, many people think that you are talking about euthanasia, mercy killing. They will be up against arms. And finally, the legal factors. The law has to be friendly. But I already told you, the law need to come in only when there's a conflict of opinion. If everybody is agreed, it is not necessary. Parul, uh, I think your first possibility, you can't change things by yourself, Parul. You are only a human being. It will be like trying to break your head against hitting a wall. Okay, suppose how can you change the perception of the professionals? Suppose you get 2 professors from one from UK and USA. They are always impressive in the Middle East. If there are 2 speakers with white skin, that is really helpful to carry your argument forward. Get a couple of people, organize a webinar for the whole uh, professionals. You must be having several kinds of things in your hospitals, or in the for the whole country, or for the city. Organize a webinar on end of life care. Get some European or US speakers to speak about it, and then things will become better. A few people will start thinking, hey, this girl is talking sense. These people all think like that. That's one thing. But changing these things by public awareness is also important. Parul, write about it. Write about it in college times.
Sure. Sir, the thing is, when I speak about such things, even in our departmental meetings, one thing is I feel because we are, I read about palliative and other things, I feel there is like people are not aware of these things. What we learn from our undergraduation to masters till now is only to do and do and do. And it is such a gray area that people are even scared to discuss about it. And when we get interns or house surgeons, and when I start teaching about sometimes try to discuss end of life care or palliative care, they feel I have come here to learn intubation, central line, and this lady is teaching me end of life care, or discussing medical ethics. So I feel the thing is, I feel it should be a part of the MBBS curriculum, sir. Not I should learn it now. The
Parul,
medical, yeah.
Parul, from 2019,
Yeah.
it's a part of medical curriculum. End of life care has now been included. But Parul,
Okay.
who is going
Yeah.
to teach it? It's going to be taught by doctors who still believe that you have to jump on the chest of every dying person. So,
True.
though it is in the curriculum, it will take a long time, which is why I said, Parul,
Yeah.
that this change takes time. You
Yeah.
are alone. People think you are crazy. Divya knows this very well. Divya has been struggling with this for years, and change is resisted, which is why I said, don't be a lone fighter. You can't win a war by yourself. You want a few people to listen, which is why I suggested organize repeated sessions, bring in more people, build an army. You will find that if you have such a webinar and there are
Yes.
30 people in the room, at least
Yeah.
3 will come to you later and said, hey, Parul, I think you were talking sense.
Yeah.
So only 8 minutes left for discussion. Anybody else has a question?
Good afternoon, Dr. Raju, Dr. Kevin.
Dr. Kevin, where are you from?
I am from UAE. I
Okay.
work with Ministry of Health. And I was hearing to what Parul was saying regarding the end of life care. Actually, even in the Ministry of Health, we have a protocol for end of life care. But whenever we have faced situation of the end of life, the 3 physicians never signed on the document. They were hesitant, or they were sort of afraid to do so. I don't know what was the real reason. That is why I agree with you that it's most over the doctor's perception of duty of care that's most important, that we are not able to implement this end of life care decision. But I have another question to you, sir. Regarding the corporate hospitals, how can we go about doing this? Because most of time it is not the doctor who decides the treatment; it is the management.
Kevin, there is these business management people talk about management of change. That's a big thing. Change is resisted, change is difficult. So where would you like to start? Would you like to start where it is the hardest or where it is easier? I think starting with corporate hospitals is very tough. I think it will be easiest to start with institutions that are in the public sector, that too reputed organizations. Recently, All India Institute of Medical Sciences came out with a position statement. They have withdrawn it since then. They're saying they want to modify it. They brought out a document about end of life care. So, Kevin, corporate, I mean, that's only my perception. I think corporate hospitals will be harder. But if this initiative starts with public hospitals, that may be easier. I'm not saying don't try in UAE, by all means do, but always get a few people together. You can't do these fights by yourself. You need a few people with you, otherwise, you will get exhausted. If you want to go far, don't walk alone. If you want to go somewhere quick, walk alone, but you won't get very far.
So there is a question about organ donation.
Sunil, you are not audible.
There is a question about organ donation, Nina, Dr. Nina. What about organ donation or eye donation in terminal cases? Who can do it? Who cannot? I would like to get knowledge on that.
Nina, where are you from? From India or elsewhere? If you are within India, from the discussion so far, everybody appears to be in UAE. But no, if you are if you are Nina, yes, Nina, well, we do not have clear law about many things. There is some clarity of law about an organ donation. Typical. Unless if you are going to consider organ donation, the laws are very clear. We have a clear law about diagnosing brain death. This cannot be done for anybody who is just vegetative, but if brain death is established, then the family can, or if the person may have written it in the will, the family can be discussed with, and that's how organ donations happen. We do have a law covering that. It's fairly clear. But only for brain death, mind you. Brain death, when you continue ventilation, go through the formalities, harvest the organs, then stop the life support.
Sir, Gopal here. Excellent presentation, sir. Real eye-opener.
Thank you,
But I would like to say that what the person at the head end feels at the time of crisis, there is so much pressure, and that we are forced to do, we are torn between our duty and the choice. So unless and until, I mean, as everybody knows, doctors are, everybody is looking for a scapegoat, and doctors are the easiest prey. So I think the blame game has to stop, and it is the fear of being blamed that make us do things even if we don't want to. For example, a patient with cardiac arrest, CPR done, intubated, brain dead. We have had this patient on ventilator for almost close to 2 years, tracheostomized, and but his brain is gone, but everything else is working well. So everybody looks at the head end of the table to do the things, and if it is not done, we are scared that they might point fingers and say that he died because he didn't do enough. So the blame has to stop first.
Gopal, you are an anesthetist.
Yes.
That's why you are talking about the head ends. I am also an anesthetist.
I know, sir.
Look, Gopal, you are right. But you see the discussions that happened. These societal factors are important. The legal factors are important. Once you have taken care of your own sense of duty, all these things happen. But what is happening today is that we are not taking a decision about our duty of care as a profession. And we are saying the family doesn't accept, the society doesn't accept, which is not always true. It is sometimes true. And unless we are clear as professionals what our duty of care, how can we teach it to the society? Gopal, I agree with you. It's very difficult. And I also have traveled that journey. I have done things against my own instinct. I have caused harm to people by reviving them. All this has happened. So I am not saying that that's unimportant. I am only saying that unless we are clear about what our duty is, the society is not going to change.
Anybody else want to ask or comment?
Sir, sir, I was in that MBBS group, sir. So, sorry, sir, Rajgopal says wrong firm. The laws of palliative care, what are they? So just guidance, if you can just tell, just so that I can prepare for the MBBS curriculum. The next, it's in that other group. Just laws of palliative care. What are laws of palliative, LAWS, laws of palliative care, which to be taught to undergraduates?
Yeah, Divya, maybe that is not
not
the subject relevant here, but a quick answer is India does not have a law related to palliative care. But in the absence of a law, when there is no clear law, the legal decisions are taken on. First, the hierarchy is like this. Law is on top. If there is no law, a Supreme Court judgment, if not a High Court judgment. If that's also not there, the statement of a statutory body like Medical Council or ICMR. Those are the things that have become valid. Unfortunately, we have no law related to palliative care, no court judgment related to palliative care. All that we have is that weak ICMR document on it.
Guidelines?
Next to statutory bodies' opinions, the next thing in the hierarchy would be guidelines of professional organizations. Now, there are a few guidelines in our own country, like the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine guidelines regarding end-of-life care are there. There are a few guidelines with the Indian Association of Palliative Care, and that comes lowest down in the hierarchy. Thank you, Gopal, for pointing that out.
Sir, talking about laws, sir, isn't there a Supreme Court directive about making advance directives? And
Yes.
Do you think that will help if people are encouraged to make the advance directives so that it's not... unnecessarily, treatment is not unnecessarily prolonged. So.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, towards the end of my presentation, I did talk about that Supreme Court judgment. I have also given the link. So when the presentation is shared with you, we'll see it. But legally, according to the Supreme Court judgment, as I told you, I have written my own advance directive. But according to the Supreme Court judgment, I have to get it countersigned by a first-class magistrate. The first-class magistrate doesn't know what this is all about. So I'll first have to go and educate him. I'll have to walk around the verandas of the first-class magistrate's court several days. I want a good death, but I do not want to spoil my whole life running after this just to gain a good death. So technically, the big point is the court has accepted advance directives as valid. And unless there is a conflict within my family and the doctor, I'll be okay. Sunil understands this. My family understands this. The most important thing, rather than the law, rather than the society, the most important thing is our family must be together. Your advance directive is totally meaningless unless you have discussed it with your family and everybody understands. Because there is a saying, dead people do not go to court. Living relatives go to court. Any sensible doctor will rather go by what the family wants rather than by my advance directives, because I cannot go to court once I am dead. Thank you. I have, Sunil must be getting very annoyed. I have exceeded time by 4 minutes. Thank you everybody for that very warm, bright discussion.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So now we know that we have to do something else. Even we knew this, but we don't have the courage to do that, or we don't know how to go about it. So at least we understand that we can do something in this situation. So we will move on to patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Kadrin. Dr. Kadrin?
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can I share already?
Yes,
Yes.
you can share.
Yeah, but it is disabled.
I don't please enable her to share the presentation.
Where is Catherine from?
I am from Philippines.
Okay, Catherine. Very good.
Yeah. Hello. Hello, everyone.
Catherine Dukley.
Yeah, that's my name. I think I cannot share because it is disabled.
Wait for a minute.
Please try once again.
Can you try once again?
Catherine, try again.
Okay.
I think you can share. Otherwise, I will share from my end. No issues.
Okay, you can already. Sorry. Okay. So I am Catherine Lee from the Philippines, and I'm going to give a case report on end-of-life care. Okay, we have a case of a 33-year-old female who was diagnosed with breast cancer stage 4 with already pulmonary and bone metastasis during the diagnosis. So that was just last year, 2020. So it was invasive ductal carcinoma, and the patient already had cycles of palliative chemotherapy and with doxorubicin and cyclophosphamide. So patient came with an sudden right-sided body weakness of few hours duration. So last January 31, patient had low-grade fever, aspiration of ingested water. She was drinking water, then suddenly she had a choking spell, sudden decrease in verbal output, headache, facial drooping, right-sided weakness, particularly the right leg, without regard to people, and decreased in activity. On examination, of course, there was large foul-smelling breast mass at the right, but in the neuro-PE, it was right hemianopia, preferential gaze to the left, sluggish corneal right eye, and does not shrug nor protrude tongue. So no verbal output, and occasionally follows command by hand gripping only. Okay, on day 1, the patient was already referred to neurosurgery, and then they are for standby decompressive hemicraniectomy if the patient deteriorates, medical oncology to hold off ongoing chemotherapy, rehabilitation medicine to prevent complications of immobility, facilitate communication and recovery of the patient, to prevent worsening of the patient in terms of spasticity, to improve the muscle strength, and to facilitate dysphagia or evaluation of the patient. Only day 4 and day 5, they recognized the referral to hospice and palliative care. So on initial visit of the hospice and palliative care, so this was our notes. The patient was GCS-10. Initial rapport was done, introduction of the service and roles was done to the family, rendering psycho-emotional support and assisting the family on the goals of care. So assessing also the openness for advanced directives and assisting in home care preparations already. So for the dyspnea, since the patient already had dyspnea during that time and pain from the lung and bone metastasis, patient was given morphine 10 milligrams, 1/2 tablet per NGT. So this was round the clock. And for the secretions, since there were a lot, HNB hyoscine was given 20 milligrams IV Q8 hours. So as you can see, the impression of the palliative care, the patient already had a PPI score of 8.5, indicating less than 3 weeks of survival. So day 13, neurology was still active. CT scan came out and there was a left middle cerebral artery territory infarct, acute to subacute. And patient already had desaturations. So intubation was already done. And the patient also had hemodynamic instability. So they started already with inotropics such as norepinephrine. And epinephrine was given every now and then. So patient also was referred to pulmonology, and the assessment was obstructive shock, probably from massive pulmonary embolism. At this point, palliative care asked already the sign of DNR. So no IG catheter insertion and hemodialysis anymore, but to continue medications and investigatory laboratories. So for the medications were for the acute stroke, mannitol, omeprazole for the stress gastritis, paracetamol, lactulose, standby diazepam for seizures, although the patient had no seizures during the stay, oral potassium chloride, and antibiotics because they were thinking of concomitant pneumonia because of the low-grade fever and the copious secretions and infiltrations in the lungs. So morphine also was still given round the clock. For the psychosocial aspects, mother is the caregiver and the patient is the eldest and the only unmarried child. So the mother had 4 children and she was living alone in their house with this eldest child. So adjusted and coping difficulties. So the mother had confusion and the family had confusion with the active treatment of stroke and given by the different referral service, specialty services, and the end-of-life care given by the palliative care. So the decision-making needs and difficulties by the family, because it was always the mother who is already senior citizen who is with the patient. So the most distressing issues identified during that time was the dyspneic episodes, pulmonary secretions, which were addressed by the palliative care by hyoscine and the morphine. So of course, the poor prognosis and also start of anticipatory care. So for on the day 14 or the second week, the hospice and palliative care noted more hemodynamic instability. The goals already was to provide anticipatory care to the mother and provide comfort to the patient in terms of the symptoms burden, like transition to a more peaceful death. So we already discontinued all meds except for the comfort medication, particularly the midazolam and morphine, which was discontinued because the low BP and during the intubation time. So it was resumed, and we resumed also the hyoscine. Diazepam was given for frank seizures. So on that same day, later that night, the patient already went into cardiogenic shock with antecedent cause of death was pulmonary embolism, and the underlying cause was still breast cancer stage 4. So in summary, we have a case of a 38-year-old female, terminal case of breast cancer with lung and bone metastasis, came in due to right-sided body weakness, which turned out to be ischemic stroke. So referred to neurology for stroke management and pulmonology for pulmonary embolism. Palliative care was just on board on the 4th hospital day, which took care of the anticipatory and end-of-life care and comfort for the patient and family until the expiration of the patient on the 14th hospital day. For the discussion points, so when do we incorporate palliative care in active management of acute symptoms? So where the patient's family had already confusion. So implementation of advanced care planning, when should it start and when should bereavement counseling commence? Should it commence after the death or during the process of the death? So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Catherine.
Yes, thank you. I will stop share.
Yeah. So we have a 33-year-old woman with carcinoma breast with metastasis, and she sustained a stroke followed along with pulmonary embolism. So Catherine is asking when to incorporate palliative care in active management of acute symptoms.
Yes.
So anybody can comment on this.
Yes. Sunil, I think you're on mute.
Yeah. So Gopal Nair says from the when they from the time of admission, and Dr. Kevin says from the diagnosis. Sir, how can we incorporate? Yeah, Dr. Parul says from the time where the life cannot be salvaged back. Dr. Kanagasabha says from hospital admission. There are many answers from the first visit. Yeah. Sir,
I think the incorporation of palliative care should have started during the diagnosis. It's correct. So during the diagnosis was already stage 4 cancer. So it's very, very imminent that the patient can go in just a few months or in just a few months time. So palliative care should be started at the time of diagnosis. So during the time, the patient also had incurring symptoms already of pain, but the patient was went to her oncologist for the pain management and not the palliative care specialist. So the first time palliative team saw her was on the 4th day. So looking back, it could have a better it would provide a lesser confusion to the family if they were prepared from the time of diagnosis leading to the last hospitalization.
Sunil, I am deliberately holding myself back. I think good answers are being given. I'm hoping to hear more from the participants. I do have something to say, but I think I'll wait.
Please unmute yourself and speak if anybody wants to comment.
Maybe I'll ask a question to everybody. Very basic question. Here you mentioned that palliative care should start at the time of diagnosis. Are we now agreed at least towards the end of the course that what palliative care is? Catherine, you mentioned that the patient has advanced illness and therefore it should be started early. But please remember what we started with. We agreed that palliative care is treatment of all serious health-related suffering. So, as you correctly said, I totally agree. Palliative care should have started when her suffering started, which may have been around the time of her diagnosis. So, arising from that, we are moving onwards onto this time. Unfortunately, that is theory. Practice is different. Most people do not get palliative care till pretty late. Therefore, the earlier it's started, the better. As early as possible. Not only when the patient is already in the ICU. That would have been good. But what do you think, the whole group? When should, what's the best time for preparing advanced medical directives? Do please comment, somebody. When is the best time to prepare advanced care planning? Has anybody in this group, apart from me, prepared your own advanced medical directive? Nobody. Let me tell you, I don't see any hand raising.
Yeah. There are answers, sir.
Okay. In the chat box.
As soon as possible, whenever we are ready to accept their own help after diagnosis. Yeah.
So, Sunil, for some reason I have a problem. I am not seeing the chats here. So please continue to read it out whenever something comes up. Thank you. If you ask me, for the 21 participants here, 20 participants excluding me. The best time to write your advanced directives is today. Sorry to say this, 10% of us will die a sudden death. It is usually happens in old age, but that's not an absolute rule. Those who have been courageous enough to think about it, please do it early. What do we lose? Encourage discussions. It is good to discuss these things within the family. But I agree. Writing the advance directive without discussions in the family is totally meaningless. You
So
have
Dr.
to discuss.
Dr. Namrata says she discussed it with family.
Very good. Even if you have not written down Namrata, this is more important. Discussion with the family. Back to you, Sunil.
Okay. So it should be done as soon as possible, as with sir's words, if possible today itself. Yeah, I don't. Please unmute Dr. Vidya. She wants to speak.
Dr. Divya?
Yeah.
Ma'am, you can
So,
speak now.
as soon as we are now when we are fine only, sir, and when patient is fine also, that is the best time.
Yes. Yes. So the only thing I added was, it should be written, but it should be also discussed within the family. And as Divya says, if you do it today, that's good. On the chat box, I have just given you a link. This was written in the newspaper Hindu by one of my colleagues, Jeena. She writes how she initiated the conversation with her dad and mom. It's interesting, very nice article. You may want to read this.
Okay. So the next question was, when should bereavement counseling commence? So when should we start bereavement counseling? All of you have seen deaths happening, not only in the wards, in ICU. So when should we start bereavement counseling? After death or before death? Before the patient has died.
Good evening, sir.
Hi.
I'm Kanagasavi speaking, sir.
Yeah, Sunil, can we stop the screen share so that we can all see one another very clearly now that if you don't need the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who was speaking?
So I'm Kanagasavi speaking,
yes,
sir.
Dr. Kanagasabha.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Wonderful session, sir.
Thank you.
And regarding this question, bereavement counseling should be started before death, sir. Once we know the patient is critical, then we can start bereavement counseling with the family members.
I agree with all of you and with Dr. Kanagasabha. But let me also change the question a little bit. What are we trying to do? It's not as if we have 5 tasks today, one bereavement counseling. Please don't think of it as a procedure. Why are we having this counseling? We are counseling for grief, right? We are counseling because the person, the family would be in grief. Please remember that anticipatory grief is a major entity. The grief doesn't start when the patient dies. From the time the suspicion enters their minds, my mom may be dying. Would my mom die soon? At that point, the grief starts, anticipatory grief. So I would change the question a little bit. When should grief counseling start? when the grief starts, whether it's anticipatory grief or bereavement grief.
Anticipatory grief.
Sorry?
Anticipatory grief, sir.
Like
Yeah, like as soon as anticipatory grief, only the counseling should start.
yeah. No. Is there a, I didn't understand the question, Divya. Where are you asking what is anticipatory grief?
No, like grief counseling should start with anticipatory, as you told, like not after the patient.
Yeah. Yes. Does anybody know somebody who died of COVID?
Yes, my husband's uncle died of COVID.
Do you know the family?
Yes, we spoke also after when we had a visit, like later.
And how are they?
They were feeling the patient wanted to go home. He was telling them from hospital he was not able to contact them, but he kept on telling take me home. Then the patient's wife who the patient died. The wife was feeling bad. He was literally asking, begging us to get us home. They're causing me suffering here. And maybe did we do wrong by taking him to hospital? She was feeling guilty.
I asked this question with a specific reason. Just now I have put up a link on the chat box. Earlier I had put up a link to a Hindu article. Now I have put up our website link. COVID grief is worse than most. It is not like a relative dying of an illness. Here, the person is suddenly taken away from you and is never seen again. For that wife family, yesterday the man was having fever. You did a swab. Then that day diagnosed, ambulance comes, he goes. Never again seen. The usual healing process of a hug, a kiss on the forehead, all that is denied to them. The healing process that goes with seeing the dead body, doing the prayers, again a kiss on the forehead, all that's also lost. So the death following COVID causes more grief to the survivors than any other. She may have just taken one look at the face as the staff took the sit down, and that's it. I have put up this, Divya, and everybody, you spoke up, there are many others who have not spoken. Everybody now knows somebody who has died of COVID, and that family needs support. They are very likely at risk of complicated grief, going into depression, being unable to get back to normal life, living with the guilt. And I have put in that a link for a free helpline. Please, the problem is the grieving will not have the initiative to call the helpline. So very often you have to support this process.
So
You
we
let
are
us, sorry, you let us say, okay, do you want help? Can I call them and connect them and give the phone to you? And they will have to be, they may need support because they are so much in grief that they will not have the initiative to dial on the phone. Sorry, I have exceeded time. Thanks, Sunil.
Is it available in all languages, sir? The grief?
Eight languages. Just go to that link and see. Kannada, yes. Hindi, Bengali, Assamese, Malayalam, Tamil.
So I just want to say we were talking about the grief of family, but and the patient knows that they are going to die, they also grieve. So I think it is also important to think in that terms from the patient point of view about the grief.
Absolutely.
So, Catherine, shall we stop here?
Yes.
Catherine,
So
thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
I learned a lot also. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for being with us and giving us a good insight on how to manage end of life. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Catherine, for a beautiful patient story.